I want you to think about how many small, unquestioned routines exist inside the buildings you spend time in. The specific procedures nobody actually explains to you that simply become normal because you've been told at some point early on that this is just how things are done here. I want to tell you about one of those routines at a hotel where I worked the overnight shift for just over a year, and the 14 months it took me to finally ask a question I should have asked on my very first night. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm a 26-year-old woman, and for a little over a year I worked the overnight desk at a mid-sized hotel just off the interstate outside Louisville, Kentucky. The kind of hotel that catches long-haul travelers, wedding overflow, occasional business guests passing through on their way to somewhere else. The shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and for most of that year it was quiet, uneventful work, checking in the occasional late arrival, handling the rare noise complaint, restocking the lobby coffee station before the day shift arrived. On my very first night of training, my manager, a woman named Denise, who had worked there for almost a decade, walked me through the property, room by room, floor by floor, the way you do with any new hire learning a building's layout. When we reached the second floor, she paused outside room 14, gestured at it without quite looking at it directly, and said simply, "That room's always occupied. Don't worry about it. Don't try to service it. Don't put it in the available inventory. Corporate handles that one separately." I did not think much of it at the time. Hotels have odd little exceptions sometimes. A room reserved permanently for a regional manager's occasional visits, a unit taken out of rotation for renovation that never quite gets scheduled, a suite blocked off for reasons that trickle down through management without ever being fully explained to overnight staff. I nodded, wrote it in my training notes, and moved on with the rest of the walkthrough. This is the story of the 14 months it took me to stop accepting that explanation, and what I found when I finally stopped. For most of that first year, room 14 was simply background noise in my job, the same way an odd company policy at any workplace eventually stops registering as odd at all. I saw it on my nightly walkthroughs, its door indistinguishable from the 11 other rooms on that floor except for the "Do Not Disturb" placard that hung on the handle every single night, without exception, in the same slightly crooked position I never once saw adjusted. I asked about it a handful of times over those months, in the casual, half-curious way you ask about small workplace oddities that don't actually bother you enough to push hard for an answer. Denise gave slightly different explanations each time I asked. Once it was a long-term corporate reservation, once it was a maintenance issue that predated her own employment. Once she simply said, "Some rooms just work that way," and changed the subject with a tone that suggested the conversation was over. I remember noting even at the time that a genuinely simple explanation should not require 3 different versions across 3 separate conversations, but I filed that observation away the same way I filed away most small workplace inconsistencies, as something mildly curious rather than something requiring real investigation. I noticed over time a few specific details that should have concerned me sooner than they did. The room never appeared in our reservation system as occupied by any actual guest name. It simply showed as unavailable, a status normally reserved for rooms under maintenance, with no checkout date, no billing information, nothing that would normally accompany a genuinely booked room, corporate or otherwise. Every other permanently blocked room I encountered over that year, and there were a handful, always carried at least some administrative note explaining the block, a work order number, a manager's initials, something. Room 14 carried nothing, just the single word unavailable, sitting there in the system month after month with no supporting documentation of any kind. Housekeeping never served it. I noticed this specifically because I processed the overnight housekeeping logs as part of my closing duties, and room 14 never once appeared on any cart's route, any linen request, any of the routine service documentation that every other occupied room generated multiple times a week. I asked one of the housekeeping supervisors about it once, an older woman named Rosa, who had worked there even longer than Denise, and she simply shook her head and told me that room wasn't hers to worry about, in a tone that suggested this was a settled matter rather than an open question. And perhaps strangest of all, in 14 months of working that overnight desk, I never once saw a single person enter or exit that room. Not during my shift, not in the security camera footage I occasionally reviewed for unrelated incidents, not reflected in any log, any note, any handoff communication between shifts. A room that never checked in a guest, never received housekeeping, and never showed a single person coming or going, and yet remained permanently, unquestionably occupied, according to everyone above me, for longer than I had worked there. The specific night everything shifted for me started with something almost too small to mention. A guest on the second floor calling down to the front desk around 1 a.m., complaining about a faint sound coming through the wall she shared with room 14. Not loud, she said, not disruptive enough to demand we do anything drastic, just a steady, low hum, and occasionally, she thought, though she wasn't certain, something that sounded like movement. I told her I would look into it, mostly as a courtesy, fully expecting to find nothing, the way you expect most guest complaints about ambient hotel noise to resolve themselves into nothing specific at all. I walked up to the second floor and stood outside room 14 for a long moment, listening, the hallway silent except for the distant hum of the building's own ventilation system somewhere overhead. There was, in fact, a faint hum coming from inside, the kind of low, steady sound that could plausibly be an air conditioning unit, a refrigerator, any number of ordinary hotel room appliances running on their own schedule. I told myself that was almost certainly what I was hearing. I told myself this the way you tell yourself things you want to be true, rather than things you've actually confirmed, standing there in a dim hallway at 1 in the morning with nothing but my own uneasy curiosity for company. But standing there, I noticed something I had walked past a dozen times before without registering it clearly. A thin strip of light was visible beneath the door, not the flickering, inconsistent light of a television left on, but a steady, even glow, the specific quality of a lamp or overhead fixture left on continuously, night after night, in a room that supposedly had no guest at all. I went back down to the front desk and pulled up the reservation system again, staring at room 14's entry with an attentiveness I had never given it before. Unavailable, no guest name, no checkout date, no billing record of any kind. I checked the room's status history, a feature I had genuinely never once used in 14 months of working there, clicking through menus I barely remembered existed, and found that it had been marked exactly this way, continuously, without a single change for over 3 years, well before Denise herself had started working at the property, well before, as the system's own records indicated, anyone currently employed there had any direct knowledge of how or why that status had originally been set. I sat there for a long time after finding that timestamp, the lobby silent around me, feeling the specific cold weight of a question I no longer had any comfortable way of avoiding. I did not sleep well after that shift ended. I went home that morning and found myself, despite genuine exhaustion, pulling up everything I could about the hotel's ownership history, half out of curiosity, half out of a specific unease I could not fully name yet. The property had changed management companies twice in the past 5 years, according to public business filings, though the physical building and most of the staff had apparently remained largely unchanged through both transitions, the kind of ownership turnover that happens quietly in the hospitality industry, rarely affecting the day-to-day experience of anyone actually working the floor. I read through as much of that filing history as I could make sense of, none of it directly mentioning Room 14 or anything resembling an explanation, before I finally gave up and tried to sleep, unsuccessfully, for most of the rest of that day. I went back for my next shift with a plan I felt slightly foolish about even as I was forming it. I wanted to talk to Marcus, the hotel's maintenance supervisor, a man who had worked at the property longer than almost anyone else on staff, including Denise. Marcus worked days primarily, but occasionally covered emergency maintenance calls overnight, and I had built enough of a casual rapport with him over the past year to think he might actually give me a straight answer where Denise consistently hadn't. I caught him on a night he'd come in for an unrelated plumbing issue on the 4th floor, and I asked him directly, without much preamble, what he actually knew about Room 14. I remember trying to keep my tone casual, the way you try to make a genuinely important question sound like idle curiosity, though I don't think I was especially convincing. He was quiet for a long moment, in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that he did in fact know something specific. He glanced around the hallway, an instinctive, slightly furtive gesture that did nothing to reassure me, before he finally said, in a lowered voice, that Room 14 had been used for years, quietly, by someone with a master key and administrative access to the property's security system, someone who had set the room's status to permanently unavailable, specifically so it would never be assigned to an actual paying guest, never be serviced by housekeeping, and never draw the kind of routine staff attention that any normally functioning room would eventually attract. He would not tell me who. He said specifically that it was not his place to say, and continuing to ask questions about it was, in his professional opinion, not something I actually wanted to do. I want you to understand how unsettling that specific piece of advice was, coming from a man who had otherwise always been straightforward with me about everything else at that job, including things considerably more sensitive than an odd room status. His unwillingness to elaborate further told me almost as much as an actual answer would have. I did not let it go, despite Marcus's warning, and despite a growing, specific dread that told me letting it go might genuinely have been the wiser choice. 3 nights later, doing my normal walkthrough, I found Room 14's door open. Not wide open, but ajar, a gap of perhaps 4 or 5 inches, light spilling out into the hallway in a way I had never once seen in 14 months of walking past that same door. I stood there for a long moment, my heart rate climbing in a way that felt entirely disproportionate to a simply open door, telling myself that whoever had access to that room had likely just stepped out momentarily, that the reasonable thing to do was continue my walkthrough and address it through normal channels rather than looking inside myself. I ran through those reasonable options in my head: call Denise, note it in the log, wait until morning and mention it to management directly, and I want to be honest that I considered every single one of them seriously for at least a few seconds each before curiosity overrode all of them completely. I looked inside myself. What I saw in the few seconds before I made myself step back and close the gap in my own view was not what I had spent the previous week half expecting, not a squatter's makeshift living space, not evidence of some illicit affair being conducted with hotel complicity, not any of the more mundane, if still concerning, explanations I had constructed in my head during that long sleepless day after finding the status history. The room's bed had been pushed against one wall, and in its place stood a bank of small monitors, perhaps 8 or 9 screens total, mounted on a folding table, each one displaying a different angle of what I recognized with a lurch of genuine horror as other rooms throughout the hotel, hallways, and at least 2 screens showing the interiors of guest rooms themselves, rooms I knew from the system were currently occupied by actual paying guests who had no idea their space was being watched. I remembered the specific, sickening clarity of recognizing one of those rooms as belonging to a family I had personally checked in 3 hours earlier, a mother and 2 young children I had chatted with briefly about their long drive from Ohio. I backed away from that door as quietly as I could manage, my hands shaking badly enough that I nearly dropped my phone twice before I made it back downstairs to the front desk, where I locked myself behind the counter and called the police with a voice I did not entirely recognize as my own. Officers arrived within 11 minutes, a response time I remember specifically because I watched the clock behind the front desk count down every single one of those minutes with an intensity I had never given a clock before in my life. I met them in the lobby, gave them the room number, and watched from a careful distance as 4 officers moved up the stairwell toward the second floor, weapons holstered but hands positioned with clear readiness, radios murmuring low, coordinated updates as they cleared the hallway toward that door. The room was empty when they entered. Whoever had been using it at some point in the roughly 20 minutes between my discovery and the police arriving had apparently left, taking at least a portion of the equipment with them, though enough remained, according to what officers told me afterward, to make clear exactly what had been happening in that room for what investigators would later determine was a period of several years. I stood at the bottom of that stairwell the entire time, arms wrapped around myself, watching officers move in and out of the second-floor hallway, unable to fully process what I had actually just walked in on. The monitoring setup was more extensive than what I'd glimpsed through that few-inch gap in the door. Investigators found evidence of hidden cameras wired throughout multiple floors of the property, concealed within smoke detectors, alarm clocks, and decorative wall fixtures in at least 14 different guest rooms, all feeding back to that central monitoring station in room 14, a room that had been deliberately, systematically kept off every normal operational record, specifically to allow this to continue undetected for years. The investigation that followed identified the individual responsible as a former IT contractor who had done security system installation work for the hotel's previous ownership group nearly 6 years earlier, work that had apparently included setting up the property's camera and access control systems he had, investigators believe, quietly built a permanent, undetectable back door into before that contract ever officially ended, maintaining both physical and digital access to the property across 2 subsequent changes in ownership and management, none of whom had ever thought to fully audit or replace the security infrastructure they'd inherited. Denise, when I spoke to her afterward, seemed as genuinely shaken as I was, insisting she had truly believed the explanations passed down to her, inherited secondhand from whoever had trained her years earlier, an unbroken chain of well-meaning people simply repeating an answer none of them had ever personally verified. The scope of what investigators eventually uncovered took weeks to fully document. Recovered storage devices, found both in the abandoned equipment left behind and through a subsequent search of a storage unit rented under the contractor's name, contained footage spanning years, involving what investigators estimated, based on room turnover records cross-referenced with the recovered file timestamps, could have been several hundred guests over the full period the system had been operational. I sat through a portion of the resulting legal proceedings, called as a witness given that I was the one who had ultimately discovered and reported the setup. I will not pretend that testifying was easy, or that hearing the full scope of what had been happening, one floor above where I'd worked so many quiet, uneventful overnight shifts, was anything other than deeply disturbing to sit with. I remember sitting in that courtroom hallway beforehand, waiting to be called, thinking about every single overnight shift I had worked in that building, every guest I had checked in without a second thought, and understanding fully, for the first time, exactly what had been happening quietly above and around all of it the entire time. The hotel's current management, to their credit, cooperated fully with the investigation once it began, and undertook a complete security audit and system replacement in the aftermath, a process that I learned secondhand after I eventually left that job, uncovered several additional access points and vulnerabilities that had gone unnoticed through 2 prior ownership transitions, each one assuming, reasonably but incorrectly, that whatever security infrastructure they inherited had been properly vetted by whoever came before them. It was, as one of the detectives explained to me during a follow-up interview, a strikingly common pattern in cases like this, not a single dramatic security failure, but a slow accumulation of unexamined inherited trust, passed down through successive owners and managers, none of whom had ever been the one who originally built the system, and none of whom had ever felt it was specifically their responsibility to question it. The contractor was eventually located and arrested roughly 3 months after that night, apprehended in a different state, and charged with numerous counts related to unlawful surveillance and voyeurism, spanning the full period investigators were able to document. I will not detail the specifics of the legal outcome, both because it does not undo what happened to the guests recorded before I ever thought to ask a real question about room 14, and because I want the final thing you take from this story to be something useful rather than simply upsetting. I left that job about 4 months after the investigation concluded, not because of any lingering unsafety at the property itself, which genuinely had been thoroughly secured and audited by that point, but because I found I could no longer walk that second-floor hallway without a specific, persistent unease that no amount of time seemed to fully resolve. I would find myself glancing at that door every single shift, even long after it had been fully renovated and returned to normal rotation, even after new carpet and new furniture had erased every visible trace of what that room had once contained. What stays with me most, more than the discovery itself, is how completely ordinary the entire arrangement had felt for so long. 14 months. A room that never checked in a guest, never received housekeeping, and generated a slightly different explanation every time anyone asked about it. And every single person on staff, myself included for the vast majority of that time, simply accepted it, because accepting unexplained workplace routines is so much easier than pushing back against them. I think about that specific ease often, the sheer social and institutional momentum required to keep a lie like that running smoothly for years, requiring nothing more sophisticated than ordinary people's ordinary reluctance to ask a second, harder question after receiving a first, unsatisfying answer. If you work in hospitality or in any industry with unquestioned procedural exceptions handed down from management without full explanation, I want you to take one specific thing from what happened at that hotel. a policy that cannot be clearly explained, that shifts explanation every time you ask, and that conveniently excludes a specific space from every normal channel of oversight, housekeeping, billing, guest logs, deserves more scrutiny than the easy comfort of simply not asking twice. And if you ever stay in a hotel yourself, it costs you nothing to do a basic visual sweep of your room, checking smoke detectors, alarm clocks, and unusual decorative fixtures for anything that doesn't look quite right, particularly anything with a small, unexplained lens or light. Most rooms, the overwhelming majority of them, are exactly what they appear to be. But some rooms are kept permanently, quietly unavailable for reasons that have nothing to do with maintenance and everything to do with someone counting on the fact that most of us have simply been trained by every ordinary workplace we've ever been part of, not to ask twice.